This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/qualityculture. If you grew up at any point since the 1980s, you undoubtedly encountered children's stories centered around saving the planet and protecting nature, with avatars for the crumbling environment ranging from cursed creatures in Princess Mononoke, forest fairies in Fern Gully, or more recently, Te-Fiti in Moana. Although WALL-E, Pixar's 2008 sci-fi film about a lonely, trash-compacting robot, hits similar eco-friendly beats, its narrative distinctly and realistically puts forth a faceless foe in this whole quest for conservation. The director insists he was only trying to tell a love story and not push an ecological message, but WALL-E's context and social commentary inevitably led to people drawing conclusions that go further than just the robots are cute. Don't get me wrong, they definitely are, but regardless of its intentions, WALL-E also became a story about the norm of prioritizing profit and consumption, and the ways those principles manifest as complacency in larger society. And sadly, it's a film that's even more relevant now, 10 plus years later. So in this video, I'm going to loosely use it as a blueprint to touch on some of the bigger discussions surrounding climate change, and perhaps more significantly, climate inaction. The film opens in a literal wasteland, with a rusty old robot making its way through massive mounds of garbage. We see WALL-E performing the repetitive task owing to his name, Waste Allocation Load Lifter Earth Class. He compacts trash and stacks the resulting cubes into massive towers, day after day, year after year, with only a cockroach as a companion. Side note, this is one of my favorite Disney animal sidekicks. Just the fact that most people have an innate disgust for roaches, but they'd be the main survivor after all our bullshit. So they had to make them cute for this movie somehow. And I guess they couldn't use a rat because they'd already done Ratatouille. Can y'all imagine bougie Remy in a place like this? Anyway, the point is, Earth is a trash heap now, and it's the reason no one lives here anymore.
Too much garbage in your face? There's plenty of space out in space!
It's also plagued by extreme weather like sandstorms and heat waves followed by torrential downpours. WALL-E has to scavenge the corpses of his fallen brethren for replacement parts just so he can keep functioning. To what end? I don't know, because everything around him suggests the enormity and apparent impossibility of the task. Even the Earth's orbit is inundated with space debris. In short, the planet's a mess. This is where WALL-E's setting can be simultaneously viewed as an exaggeration and an understatement. An exaggeration because plastic pollution is only a tiny piece of the puzzle when it comes to real-life concerns. As David Wallace Wells notes in his book The Uninhabitable Earth, plastic panic is another exemplary climate parable, in that it is also a climate red herring. The panic arises from the admirable desire to leave a smaller imprint on the planet, and a natural horror that the environment is so polluted by detritus passing through our air, our food, our flesh. In this way, it draws on a very modern obsession with hygiene and lightness as a form of consumer grace, an obsession familiar from recycling. But while plastics have a carbon footprint, plastic pollution is simply not a global warming problem. And yet it has slid into the center of our vision, at least briefly. The ban on plastic straws occluding, if only for a moment, the much bigger and much broader climate threat. In that vein, most stories incorporating environmentalism or climate-caused apocalypse tend to put things in a framework that's simpler to understand. A lot of stories we grew up with were about recycling or how deforestation harms animals. Even the recent film Don't Look Up uses a comet to convey impending doom. And that's because the scope of the real problem is so vast and mind-bending, with a zillion moving parts that encompass nearly every facet of our day-to-day lives, that it's difficult to package in a tight narrative that people can wrap their heads around. I mean, it's what I studied in college and I'm still only mildly above a layman's understanding. So this is why WALL-E's trash-filled dystopia is also an understatement. But it kinda has to be. Plus, for sheer storytelling purposes. The director noted, "I have to get everybody off the planet, and do it in a way that audiences get it without any dialogue." So Trash did that. You look at it, you just get it. It's a dump, you've gotta move it. Even a little kid understands that. While these simplifications in media make these ideas more accessible to a general audience, they also inadvertently make it more difficult to grasp the full truth. Again, from The Uninhabitable Earth, we have for so long understood stories about about nature as allegories that we seem unable to recognize that the meaning of climate change is not sequestered in parable. It encompasses us. In a very real way, it governs us. Our crop yields, our pandemics, our migration patterns and civil wars, crime waves and domestic assaults, hurricanes and heat waves and rain bombs and mega droughts, the shape of our economic growth and everything that flows downstream from it, which today means nearly everything. Our short introduction to Wall-E's world also gives us a glimpse of that economic aspect, as it points to the main culprit of the devastation. During his wanderings, we're introduced to the by and large megacorporation, or B&L for short. This company controls basically everything. The fuel, public transportation, superstores, banks, cargo ships, the media, the currency, a planned outlet mall on the surface of the moon. The ravaged landscape is still flooded with advertisements for products, including liquid oxygen and reused food, whatever that's supposed to mean. They're even responsible for the fleet of starliners humans use to evacuate the planet.
B&L Starliners leaving each day. We'll clean up the mess while you're away.
B&L's presence seems to have influenced every aspect of people's lives on Earth, and their omnipotence continued on in space for hundreds of years. But we'll get to that later. Considering all this megacorporation essentially functions as the government, an observation also backed by the fact their CEO gives the impression of a US president, and has the authority to declare a global state of emergency. As for the real world, while we don't live in a complete and all-encompassing monopoly like this one, it's generally true that a handful of huge companies dominate a majority of the marketplace and have chokeholds on their respective industries, often buying up smaller companies in mergers and absorbing them into ever-growing commercial behemoths. Things are looking more and more like that satirical commercial from Parks and Rec.
And with enough energy, America, nothing can stop us. The all-new Verizon Chipotle Exxon, proud to be one of America's 8 companies.
Speaking of which, the Walt Disney Company, which bought Pixar in 2006 and owns several other media companies. They caught some flack for their hypocrisy in Wall-E, which seemingly criticized the very practices they regularly engage in. I do want to acknowledge there's often a disconnect between artists' intentions and the will and motives of corporate executives. Still, higher-ups were all too thrilled for the merchandising potential of Wall-E. Robert Iger, Disney's chief executive at the time, remarked, "We are poised to take advantage of broad and deep success when it comes." Not that Disney's the only company who does this. For example, children's networks pretty much exist to sell toys, and plenty of cartoons were created with the sole purpose of pushing toy lines. But similarly, why else would Frozen 2 exist? Or Cars 2 and 3, and Planes, and Toy Story 2 and 3 and 4, and this upcoming Buzz Lightyear movie, if not for the guaranteed abundance of profit from merchandise? The originals were money-making machines, with retail sales making Disney up to 10 times as much as the films themselves, mostly through licensing fees. Wall-E might as well have been rummaging around mountains of Elsa dolls and Lightning McQueen cars, or perhaps even plastic miniature versions of himself. A couple of months ago, Disney even announced a Wall-E themed NFT. You know, that crypto thing nobody really understands, but regardless has a major carbon footprint. This would be funny if it wasn't so on the nose in its hopeless irony. In a nutshell, it's pretty evident the company doesn't genuinely care about the messages they put out there, and in a way are the exact thing by and large is parodying. Disney is only a small slice of a larger problem, but they serve to illustrate some of the more nuanced obstacles we've come across when it comes to climate inaction. For example, a little over a year ago, they set a goal to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And to be fair, according to their 2020 Corporate Social Responsibility Report, they had reached their previous target of cutting net emissions by half since 2012. The issue is, while generally well-intentioned, it's regarded by many climate scientists that these net zero promises aren't enough based on where we're currently heading. Because net zero isn't zero. Instead of ending the use of fossil fuels, it relies on the idea of tacking on clean energy to the existing dirty system, and using carbon removal technologies to offset emissions. The term net zero isn't well defined anyway, leaving room for sneaky loopholes. In an article penned by 3 climate scientists, they professed, "We have arrived at the painful realization that the idea of net zero has licensed a recklessly cavalier burn now, pay later approach which has seen carbon emissions continue to soar." The point is, an effective approach to fighting climate change, or even just helping the environment, simply simply incompatible with unfettered capitalism as it is today, including Disney's business model. And just as a disclaimer, there's a difference between commerce and capitalism. In the latter, the obligation to maximize profit, especially for shareholders at the expense of everyone else, is what leads to many of the problems we're facing, including environmental devastation. Unlike in WALL-E, most countries have mixed economies, with a capitalist private sector. But for many of them, this loyalty to profit has been overriding and undermining well-meaning public policies and proposals for several decades. Like if we observe this on a micro level, the materials section of Disney's 2030 environmental goals states, "Plastic is at times the preferred material for our operations and our Disney-branded consumer product supply chain. We consider it our responsibility to balance those benefits while simultaneously addressing the serious environmental and social concerns that arise when plastic enters our natural environment." When it comes down to addressing those concerns, they cite things like banning plastic straws, including the ones on their environmentally destructive cruise ships, among other things that ultimately don't add up to much. In 2009, when they first made an environmental commitment, Robert Iger said in a statement that the purpose was to make our brands and products more attractive, strengthen our bonds with consumers, make the company a more desirable place to work, and build goodwill in the communities we operate. All of this contributes to shareholder value. And this is what it boils down to. The buzzwords companies use, the flowery language and half measures reminiscent of politicians, are another form of greenwashing, of trying to satisfy a trend so they can further appeal to the current market. Plastic straw bans, net zero, supposed supply of sustainable sources, it's all rooted in fantasy. In capitalism, profit is the driving force behind everything, and we ultimately can't work against rising temperatures if profit is the only incentive. As Naomi Klein notes in her book This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate, climate change pits what the planet needs to maintain stability against what our economic model needs to sustain itself. But since that economic model is failing the vast majority of the people on the planet on multiple fronts, that might not be such a bad thing. Put another way, if there has ever been a moment to advance a plan to heal the planet that also heals our broken economies and shattered communities, this is it. So if this system is to blame, is there any way to operate within it that still contributes to the greater good? Well, I'm gonna detour for a bit and use another beloved environmentalist tale to illustrate how good intentions tend to intersect with the reality of our situation. In other words, how our well-meaning ideals for the environment tend to clash with the motives of capitalism. In 1971, the year after the first ever Earth Day celebration, Dr. Seuss published The Lorax, a cautionary tale against abject consumerism, the pitfalls of unchecked capitalism, and environmental destruction. It's actually pretty grim compared to Seuss's other work. Like, this looks post-apocalyptic. He claimed, "In the Lorax, I was out to attack what I think are evil things and let the chips fall where they might." It tells the story of the Onceler, a businessman who exploits environmental resources for maximum profit.
"Look, Lorax, calm down. There's no cause for alarm. I chopped down just one tree. I'm doing no harm."
Despite the Lorax's pleas, the Onceler uses the land's truffula trees to make thousands of thneeds, a versatile product meant to represent commodities in general.
"We were making thneeds 4 times as fast as before, and my profits, incidentally, were soaring galore."
He makes them until there's nothing left. No plants, no animals, no clean air or water, and then even the Lorax disappears, leaving only a word behind. At the end of the book, the regretful Onceler, still living in the wasteland he created, puts the onus on the child hearing his story. He gives him the last truffula seed, a token of hope as well as a call to action. Obviously, the young character is a proxy for the reader, so the Onceler is really telling us to get it together and do something about this whole conservation thing.
"Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not."
The book's message may seem tame by today's standards, but criticizing big business for their pollution and greed was considered unconventional at the time.
"They say I'm a fool to oppose things like these, but I'm going to continue to speak for the trees."
The environmental movement had just started ramping up in the late 60s, and these issues were viewed as part of the hippie counterculture. So let's go back to that evil things quote from before. Biographers say Seuss was pretty indifferent towards money, often calling it a necessary evil and giving a lot of it away to charities. Case in point, his agent once tried to persuade him to accept an offer from a sponsor, saying if he accepted the deal, he'd go into the Guinness Book of Records as the writer who was paid the most money per word. Seuss replied, "I'd rather go into the Guinness Book of Records as the writer who refused the most money per word." He was reluctant to use his characters for marketing or merchandise, as he was protective of his work and wary of how it could be exploited for profit. The few exceptions were toys that encouraged creativity and imaginative play. To be fair, this was partly because he didn't want his name associated with potentially iffy products, and because he was a perfectionist and didn't want to lose creative control of his IP. Still, it seems he valued art over money, and wasn't a fan of gratuitous commercialism. On that note, the lorax is just as much about corporate responsibility as it is about environmentalism. How using finite resources for maximum profit is an unsustainable and destructive model. In the book Dr. Seuss and Philosophy, Oh, the Things You Can Think, Jacob Held looks at the lorax to illustrate the problems with this mode of production. We don't make things to satisfy real human needs. Things are made to be sold, because wealth is what drives capitalism, not well-being. Consider again the ridiculous thneed. No one needs a fool thneed. It is a thing that is made only to be sold. If there's no market for it, the Onceler will manufacture one through ingenious marketing. He'll make sure you know you need a thneed so he can sell you one. I'm sure he could find plenty of clever advertisers who could prey on some latent insecurity to motivate you to buy a couple.
The birth of an industry, you poor stupid guy. You telling me what the public will buy?
In the many years since his death, you may have noticed Dr. Seuss, much like Walt Disney, has become more of a brand than an extension of the man himself. With approval from Dr. Seuss Enterprises, his work is used in advertisements, new movies, a theme park, licensed products, and so on and so on. Much like thneeds, most of these seem to prioritize profit above all else. In a 2019 Forbes interview, the president of the company said, "We do use our books as our foundation, our guide. Ultimately, the market will tell you if you've done it right. Sometimes it's not the result we're looking for." It's not hard to imagine what the right result may be. I still can't get over this car commercial in partnership with the 2012 Lorax movie, which is self-explanatory in its hypocrisy.
The only certified truffle-a-tree seal of approval.
And the PR people are lying!
Big Joel made a video about how this movie ironically transforms the concept of nature into yet another commodity to exploit for human gain. In general, the movies churned out over the years seem mostly profit-driven, losing sight of the central messages under layers of convoluted plot points. Now, you might hear all this and assume Seuss is rolling over in his grave, but there might be an argument against this idea. Dr. Seuss was certainly stingy with his characters earlier in his success, but something happened in the late 60s that made him let go of this line of thinking. He was exposed to a phenomenon that revealed his financial and creative vulnerabilities as a working artist. Venture with me, friends, into the magical world of copyright law. I won't get into too much detail, but Seuss lost a lawsuit in '68, which allowed a company to produce and sell these ugly dolls based on characters he'd drawn in his Ad Man days. It was then he discovered trademarks were more effective than copyright in protecting his creative property. But to keep a trademark, you have to sell stuff. So that's what he did. Starting in the early '70s, Seuss allowed his characters into the marketplace more often.
Maybe your child's ready for a Super C&C.
3 school toys from Mattel.
He approved toys and games and bedroom sets. He licensed film rights to movie studios. He even approved the idea for the theme park at Universal. So as he published the Lorax and criticized capitalist practices, he was knowingly contributing to thneeds of his own. In an academic article called The Disneyfication of Dr. Seuss, Faithful to Profit 100%, Philip Nell, a scholar of children's literature, acknowledged that, considering Seuss's willingness to seek legal protections in the marketplace, Dr. Seuss Enterprises is not intentionally contradicting Ted Geisel's wishes. In light of trademark law's strength, the Disneyfication of Dr. Seuss must be seen as a symptom of a legal system designed to benefit capitalism more than moral or artistic values. If Dr. Seuss Enterprises has to sell lesser versions of Dr. Seuss's work in order to strengthen that work's legal standing, then there's something wrong with the system. I still don't think the current company is totally innocent in their ventures, but maybe they're not too wildly off base with what Seuss would have done. Though perhaps he wasn't being a hypocrite and felt at the time that the ends justified the means. And it seems what started out as protection of a creative legacy led to an inevitable entanglement with a system that prioritizes profit, the same capitalist machine he criticized in the Lorax. In the end, he felt compelled to go along with it despite the Lorax's warning. Maybe it's part of the reason he wrote it in the first place. This leads to where we left off with Wall-E, who ended up hurtling through space so he wouldn't lose the new love of his life, Eve, or extraterrestrial vegetation evaluator, another robot sent to Earth to locate photosynthesizing life. With Wall-E's help, she'd found what she was looking for and was on track to deliver a living plant to her spaceship's captain. Wall-E in tow, they eventually arrived at the massive starliner, the Axiom, home to the descendants of Earth's evacuees. What was supposed to be a 5-year cruise during Earth's cleanup became a 700-year way of life. We never really find out what happened to those other ships. In the Axiom's wing labeled Economy, we see what became of our species, solely riding around on hover chairs with perpetual screens in their faces, nourished by mysterious food in a cup and bombarded with BNL advertisements every waking moment.
By and large, everything you need to be happy. Your day is very important to us.
By and large's advertisements are just as dominating as we saw on Earth. There's even a sign that just says consume. Some real they live energy here. Though it seems like people on the Axiom don't have jobs, yet they still spend money. Like there are signs that say buy now, pay later, so it's implied they still pay for things somehow. I went as far as trying to inspect their screens to see if anyone was working on an Excel spreadsheet or something, but it seems this is a UBI utopia. Who knows? Their whole financial situation isn't really addressed. To be fair, it's not the point of the movie, I was just curious. Notably, we never see people spending time together. Even the babies are separated from their parents most of the time. Something as small as touching someone's hand seems like a pretty big deal in this film since they're evidently touch-starved. Which begs the question, how did these babies get here in the first place? Everyone exclusively communicates through their screens even when they're right next to each other. It's a side effect of being totally unaware of their own surroundings at any given moment.
I didn't know we had a pool.
And this is all because, like the society in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, their lives are dominated by consumption, by the next thing they can do to feel good for even just a moment.
Yeah, we did that yesterday. I don't want to do that.
Well, then what do you want to do?
I don't know. Something.
Thankfully, Wall-E's narrative doesn't succumb to the myth of personal responsibility when it comes to critiquing people's patterns.
Wally! That's it! Hey, Wally!
It's like that meme that goes, and yet you participate in society. It's generally a bad faith argument to suggest that because someone is engaging in a widespread social norm that they're an inherently bad or dumb person, or that they can't criticize those norms. They're all part of a larger whole, of a system they were likely born into that they have no individual control over. It's kind of like human programming, i.e. our directive. From the time we're born, we're encouraged to follow certain paths and accept certain beliefs, like the toddlers in the Axiom receiving lessons about the greatness of their corporate overlords.
A is for Axiom, your home sweet home. B is for by and large, your very best friend.
It's not that we can't veer off these paths and think and act for ourselves, but it's not as easy as it sounds to not follow the path of least resistance. And even if we're aware of the problems, considering the quality and quantity of options people are presented with day to day, it's nearly impossible to maintain a consistent way of life that corresponds to an idealistic worldview. This difficulty preserves the status quo and upholds a culture of complacency. We often accept the things we feel we can't change. The word axiom even means a universally accepted principle or rule. And these principles don't just spring up overnight. They're the result of centuries of incremental changes in social conditioning. The Axiom's original passengers didn't start out sitting in hover chairs at all times, never looking at each other. What's important is these norms change over time, so the issue becomes whether we can nudge them in another direction. Because let's be real, we love stuff. Even Wall-E himself placed value in objects, with his own Little Mermaid lair full of human gadgets and knickknacks. And a lot of people have gotten used to a certain level of comfort and convenience. 2-day shipping, limitless meat and dairy, fast fashion, AC blasting 24 hours a day. It's tough to imagine turning back the tide even a tiny notch, especially since in the last couple years we've witnessed how even asking for a speck of personal sacrifice causes disproportionate rage and bewilderment. Plus, like people on the Axiom, most of us are pretty occupied with what's going on in our own little bubbles. I mean, we're only human at the end of the day. We aren't really mentally equipped to manage problems of this scale. And unlike society on the Axiom, poverty, wealth disparity, and desperation cause a major detriment to our capacity to care about these big picture issues. Understandably, caring about the environment won't outweigh the need for basic necessities. As quoted in This Changes Everything, a climate change activist noted, "The future is something that is not relevant at the moment for some people because they're surviving for the present. It's difficult to understand the concept of sustainability when people are fighting for food and to have energy to heat their homes." But again, personal responsibility isn't the most pressing problem anyway, as corporations generate the large majority of emissions. When it comes down to climate change, personal choices are just that, personal. Something to derive individual satisfaction from that doesn't really make a tangible difference at the end of the day. As heated in the uninhabitable Earth, almost as a prophylactic against climate guilt, Western liberals have comforted themselves by contorting their own consumption patterns into performances of moral or environmental purity. Less beef, more Teslas, fewer transatlantic flights, but the climate calculus is such that individual lifestyle choices do not add up to much, unless they are scaled by politics. This sentiment is echoed in plenty of other notable books about climate change. These authors don't agree on everything, but one thing they all acknowledge is the notion of individual responsibility being a dangerous distraction. It's essentially a marketing campaign created by corporations to deflect blame and place the burden on the consumer. An offshoot of the original disinformation campaign, which insists that climate change isn't happening at all.
Just stay the course. Rather than try and fix this problem, it'll just be easier for everyone to remain in space.
I think on some level most people know that this idea of personal accountability is a scam, but somehow this form of marketing is still incredibly successful, with greenwashing becoming more and more rampant. In reality, like in WALL-E, the people in power have, well, the power to incite the most change.
You came a long way for a drink of water. Just need someone to look after you, that's all.
Ultimately, it was the captain of the Axiom who overcame his mental constraints and stood up to those who reinforced the status quo, namely Otto the Autopilot, whose directive was revised nearly 700 years ago.
Take control of everything and do not return to Earth. Repeat, do not return to Earth. Let's get the heck out of here.
Before the end of the film, the captain had been little more than an announcer of morning broadcasts, going along with how things had always been run. He only became a leader when the gravity of his responsibility sunk in.
Out there is our home. Home, Otto, and it's in trouble. I can't just sit here and do nothing. That's all I've ever done.
And when humans did finally return to Earth, he also became a leader in educating others. Like the people of the Axiom, we're forced to rely on leadership to make the big decisions, which is why, in the grand scheme of things, our votes matter more than what we eat or drive. Unfortunately, we don't always have leaders with our best interests in mind. Like in the US specifically, fossil fuel companies spend tens of millions every year in lobbying and campaign contributions to keep their interests prioritized, and then they get subsidized in return. In This Changes Everything, Klein points out, this dynamic will shift only when the power and wealth of the fossil fuel industry is seriously eroded, which is very tough to do. The handy thing about selling natural resources upon which entire economies have been built, and about having so far succeeded in blocking policies that would offer real alternatives, is that most people keep having to buy your products whether they like you or not. So since these companies are going to continue being rich for the foreseeable future, the best hope of breaking the political deadlock is to radically restrict their ability to spend their profits buying and bullying politicians. In the credit sequence of WALL-E, we see the Axiom's people rebuilding cities and agricultural systems, with a progression of art styles that suggest a reset of civilization. And it seems like that's basically what it's going to take, an overhaul of the pervading system, or more specifically, a reform of how these industries and corporations are essentially able to control the direction of government policy as though they're by and large. Except in our case, the Starliners won't be ready in time.
Wait, that doesn't look like Earth. Where's the blue sky?
The Axiom's passengers arrive on an Earth that is still healing from devastation, an imperfect place on which to pin their hopes. It'll be a challenge, something that'll require a collectivist effort similar to when they worked together to secure the plant in the first place. But it's not impossible.
On the Axiom, you will survive.
I don't want to survive! I want to live!
We zoom out to a landscape brimming with even more growing plants, more opportunities to improve. Even though things seem hopeless, there's still a possibility for change, regardless of whether we can envision success and focus. I still hold out hope we can phase out fossil fuels and use renewable energy in its place. The technology and public support are there. It's just a matter of convincing those in power of the urgency, or voting in those who already get it. I've linked some resources if you'd like to get involved. I'd also like to recommend a mesmerizing documentary on Mubi Mubi's platform that I think is pretty relevant to the discussion. Thanks to sponsors like Mubi, we get to spend more time making these videos. Mubi is a curated streaming service, a place to watch beautiful, interesting, and credible cinema. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. One of the films I watched recently, called Taming the Garden, is a documentary about how a billionaire former prime minister in the country of Georgia is uprooting centuries-old trees from the countryside to transplant them into his garden. We watched some members of the community grapple with the inconvenience and loss of these beloved trees, while others welcome the earnings from selling them off. Part of what's so moving about this film is that the imagery is stunning, but there's this underlying feeling that you're looking at something that shouldn't be happening, which is the exact sensation the director felt when she first saw one of the trees being transported, floating in water, and was inspired to create this film. It feels like a meditation on our modern relationship with nature, how we often commodify it and try to bend it to our will, even at its own expense, and how the wealthiest among us can often exploit the desperate conditions of the most vulnerable, again also at the expense of the environment. One of my favorite things about Mubi is that I can find really gorgeous artistic cinema like this that I probably wouldn't be exposed to otherwise, especially international films. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/qualityculture. That's mubi.com/qualityculture for a whole month of great cinema for free. And with that, I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!